Psycho-perceptional data. Again, perceptions, like that. Whole heaps of psycho-perceptional data. Now the first one, as mentioned, is forms. Forms. Visual forms. Auditory forms. Olfactory. Tactile. All these different forms that come from our senses are forms that we take in. Now, how is that processed? These heaps of information. Think about them as your dreams. Remember I mentioned about dreams and memories. Your feelings, your moods. You see the cake. All the stuff starts to arise, built on your perceptions. Not your perceptions, your experiences, your emotions from before. But these are obstructions. They're hindrances. They really lead to a deluded mind. Now forms lead to sensations, the second one. Now sensations can be of three things. They can be positive, negative, and neutral. Positive, oh gee whiz, I like the cake, this is a good thing. Desire rises, and again desire can be good as we started off talking. Excessive desire leads to craving, and craving leads to greed. Oh dear, a poison. It's based on your sensations. Negative, the other, could be aversion, leading to hate. And finally, neutral could be, I don't know anything, I'm just ignorant. Another of the poisons. This has definitely got to do, the sensations, with your body and mind. Again, from the outside, what Greg was talking about, outside senses are sights and sounds and tastes. There's your body aspect, then there's the mind. And mind can be a combination of both outside and inside, if you really take a look at it. Moods, feelings, again, memories, dreams, thoughts, ideas. Any questions? Okay, these are sensations. Now the third one, okay, perceptions. This is a deepening of your sensations where you're perceiving things. Think about this. We're dealing with consciousness. I had to rub off the other chart where consciousness was at the bottom, but also all the other consciousness that arose when the organ met and had contact with the dust, as Greg would call it. In Buddhist teachings, they often refer to it as dust, for the very analogy of dust covering a mirror. And a deluded mind doesn't see clearly because of all the stuff that we're carrying around, all these sensations, all these perceptions. And here perceptions are distinctions and recognitions. It's a mind focus here on your visual images that arise, on your sounds, on your memory. Again, the visual image of a cake, which will bring up all the sensory perception that comes. But when I think of memory with perception here, and this happens to me every time I smell homemade bread. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, made the best homemade bread. I remember her in her kitchen, this big old kitchen. And I remember her kneading it and putting it back on the heat and bringing it out and kneading it. It was a whole day thing. And then I remember her greasing the tins and putting the bread, the loaves into the tins and it rising and the smell. Oh my goodness. the smell throughout her kitchen. And then it would come out golden brown. And she'd take the butter and she'd put the butter melted on the top of a loaf of bread. Oh my. So and nobody made bread, even bake shops didn't make bread as well as she did. They were perfect loaves of bread, no machine involved, just a lot of love. So that brings back that perception of smelling bread, rising and cooking, brings back that memory of my grandmother. And it's a wonderful thing, but maybe you hated bread. Maybe your grandmother was not a kind lady. And maybe that smell of bread brings up an aversion. If that was the case, I would feel sad. This is a wonderful memory for me, but it does work that way. Okay? The fourth one, Venerable Master Sheng Yin, and it's really unfortunate. This book is no longer in print. It used to be our companion book for core teaching, core ideas. It's wonderful. And he does a wonderful job of speaking to the 18 realms and the 5 skandhas. The fourth one he has listed as activity. Activity. 4. Okay. Now here, you'll also see it on your handout as volition. You'll see it maybe as mental activity. But here, we're looking at all base actions. This is what this refers to, all your base actions. Whether they're physical or mental, this is getting into a complex area where you're taking in all the others. Unlike, and speaking to my friend, the question asked about the senses not being connected, these guys are connected. Forms, sensations, perception, mental formations, the activity, these are connected. Your sensations are all emotions. The forms lead to sensations. They're all connected. And this activity, this mental and physical activity, volition, and volition you often see in relationship to karma. Body, speech, and thought, and it's done with intention. So here we've got all these others feeding intention and karma, whether it's wholesome or unwholesome. And finally, the fifth one, consciousness. Consciousness, just like we saw. And this is exception like we did with the sensory perception, all the sense organs. Now this is where it's getting really complex with everything feeding into consciousness. And by the way, I just want to mention, when any one of the consciousness from the 18 realms is engaged, whether it's the hearing or the eye, the sight or whatever, the consciousness of form arises. If I'd had more room, I would have put one by each so that you could see. So the minute that one of the consciousness are engaged from the eye or the sense organs are engaged and the consciousness arises, the skandha of form arises. So Venerable Master describes in his book, this consciousness is individual consciousness. This is your consciousness arising. When you meditate, many students will often say, it's much better meditating in a group because there is a group consciousness. And you've got different, you've got different levels of meditators in that room that will help to elevate. Yeah, did you know that? Yeah. You get some real good meditators, some Zen masters. Whoa. If you get an opportunity, do take a meditation session with a master. It will elevate your whole experience. Yeah. So, this is very complex here. These are your thoughts. Discrimination on all these others. How we discriminate people. Judgment, evaluation. And the big thing here, and I think it was mentioned, it was mentioned this morning, you guys weren't here, sorry. This is where we get this idea of an individual self. We get to think that we're alone, that we're independent. But we already know from Greg's class, and Greg looks a little worried there, that with dependent origination, he's thinking there, he's thinking real hard, I can see that. With dependent origination, we are not alone. In fact, we are all interconnected. Everything is interconnected with something else. This is the number one cause of suffering, the illusion of a separate self. The number one cause, that we think that we are a separate individual. Now, other books I've read talks about us being separate once the umbilical cord is cut. But everything is conditions. Everything is cause and effect if we start looking at the teachings. Now, I've got a couple of examples here that might help you figure out, especially this heap of stuff. Venerable Master in the chapter talks about a computer screen with pixels. So if you stand back, you see, or even a TV, you see a really good picture. But if you've got a cheap model and doesn't have many pixels, you get up close, you don't really see the picture. So think about all these things, all these impressions coming in, all these results from our sensory perception coming in. And think about what we look like. We think we're solid, we think we're fluid. If you put yourself under a powerful neutron microscope, you're not. There's all this space everywhere, even in our skin. Organs, well, that's neat. And then there's a lot of empty space. This is important for you to start to understand this, because this will lead into other teachings. I just want to mention this now. We appear smooth, but all this stuff comes in. It all creates a screen of heaps of information, of data that's whirling around, and then our body that we think is solid and smooth isn't. Now, a police officer at a scene of an accident or crime will come up and ask witnesses what happened. And if you talk to police officers, they never get the same story from the same people, because we're all perceiving things differently. Somebody sees a Caucasian man that's tall. Somebody sees a black man that's short. And it can be because maybe they had an experience where they were mugged. Or you're walking in a dark night. And I read this one example where this woman was walking and she thought she saw her husband because the man walking toward her resembled her husband, somebody that she trusted and loved. So she smiled at this stranger, and he was fine, he just walked on, but somebody else might perceive the stranger as a threat because of an experience they had. Again, it goes to our perceptions, it goes to all the forms that we have seen. It's interesting how all this works. Are there any questions at this point to the 18 realms? We're going to go into much more detail. Did you want to make a comment? You sure? Okay. Okay. So, going back to part 2, the 4 nutriments. Ryan, do you have your sheet?
Yes.
Would you mind reading that paragraph just under the 4 nutriments for me?
Sure. If my microphone works. Oh, there we go. They say we are what we eat. If we understand the teaching of the 5 aggregates, we understand that this is exactly true. We also understand that we are what we watch, what we hear, what we read, and what we otherwise perceive. We also understand that we are what we do, what we say, what we intend, and what we think. Everything that feeds our physical or mental being, such as feelings, perceptions, volitions, and consciousness, becomes a part of us. Our food, our sensory impressions, our volitional actions, and our conscious thoughts compose our selves. And there is nothing else that can be said to be a self which does not come from one of these nutriments.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, so I don't know if you had any time to think about your homework last week, where I asked you to look at your thoughts as they arose. Some people are going, yeah. And maybe take it a little further and look at the nature of them. Positive, negative, were you upset, not upset? What made you upset? Where did that come from? Does anybody wish to comment or not? Okay. No, don't ask me. Okay. I think we got it. Take her.
When you first start practicing and you first come in here, what ends up happening is you start to look at your thoughts, but most of them are negative. The good majority, I don't know what science says about that, but then as you go along and you work on your mind, you could change that ratio around. I don't know what science says about that, but I know that it worked for me with the meditation training and the Dharma together. Basically helped me to change the suffering, basically.
Anybody else?
I just really wanted to highlight what Jan's talking about with the 18 realms of the 5 skandhas, because they're both talking about the same thing. They're both talking about how we exist. We tend to think we exist in a permanent material sense, where we're much more in activity. We're much more a process. And it's very, very subtle. Like when we talk about separation of senses, we're saying, no, I perceive the whole world. Like I've got the whole world and I've got this picture and I internalize the world, and that's an accurate description of the world, as if it's possible to have an objective reality, that we're not subjective in almost everything that we do. So an example of that is a chocolate cake. We tend to impute into something like a chocolate cake the fact that it itself contains pleasurable items. So the chocolate cake itself is good. But to a person who's diabetic, a chocolate cake may be poison. So if we start to think that not only we are a permanent self, but that the objects that we're sensing contain pleasure itself, we get caught up in the subjective world of constantly relying on things outside of ourselves to be happy. And the reality is, the world does not work like that. So we're acting in a way that we're permanent, and the things themselves contain pleasure or pain or revulsion or attractiveness, when in fact it has much to do with how we impute upon it. We give it properties that we assume are permanent. So what Jan's highlighting with this is that we think of ourselves as a thing, whereas we are more a process. Is that?
Absolutely. Okay. Yes.
I found another analogy for this. I just found our lecture online. It says, a monkey, as the sixth consciousness, is in a room that only has 5 windows. Each window is comparable to a sense: eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. Whichever window the monkey looks out determines the kind of mental activity that arises, as well as the consciousness associated with that particular sense organ. With this understanding, we can see why it is not accurate to speak of an independent existence for the first 5 sense consciousnesses. It is only when the sixth consciousness functions together with the 5 sense organs that we designate an eye consciousness, an ear consciousness, etc.
Perfect.
It
That's-
simplifies it.
That's great. The monkey in it. I like that one.
You can search that on the, it's a lecture on the Jan Meditation Center.
Excellent. Good one. Does that help?
We like monkeys.
You keep your own starving monkeys. I got my own feet. Yes, Greg.
So back to the original question about observing our thoughts. And so and connecting that with the 5 aggregates. So when we think about things like, sensation, so sensation is just when we have a perception, when we see an object, or hear an object, or smell an object, we have, and we have kind of this reaction to it, so it's either positive or negative or neutral, right? There's a lot that goes on in life that even though we might have a perception of it, we don't really have, it doesn't really arise into mind consciousness, right? So we might see things, we have eye consciousness of them, but we don't necessarily, that doesn't necessarily progress to mind consciousness, right? So there's a lot going on around me, but I don't really take any notice of it, right? Or there's, I might be eating something, but I don't really taste it all that well because I'm thinking about other things, so my consciousness is occupied with other things. So what I found when I stopped to observe my thoughts, to build on what Barry said, you actually notice that a lot of them are negative. So what actually happens when you observe them, right, so you bring them up into your mind consciousness, is that you start to have sensations about your own thoughts. Right, so your sensation, and most of your sensations are revulsion, right? You look at your thoughts and you say, my God, this is awful, why am I thinking these things? And that's actually helpful, right? Because then you start to realize, because you have that negative sensation, you actually can develop motivation to do something about it, right? Whereas most of the time, these negative thoughts are going on all the time, but because we don't observe them, because we don't take note of them, we just let them go. But if we actually pay attention to them, we actually have a sensation arise, we have that mind contact with those thoughts, then we actually have this feeling of aversion, right? Or with positive thoughts, the opposite, right? Like, oh, that's, I want my thoughts to be more like that, I want to be more peaceful, I want to be more generous, right? Not the opposite thoughts, which are, I'm being really critical, I'm being really mean, I'm being really impatient, being really nasty to that gas station attendant. Right, so the more you observe your thoughts, the more it kind of goes through this process of contact and sensation and kind of the resulting actions from it. So the act of observing it is really helpful and necessary in trying to purify your thoughts, trying to get rid of those negative qualities and negative thoughts.